Afternoon to our friends in Ecuador and good morning to our colleagues here in Australia. My name is Mary Rains. I'm the Barley Markets Manager for AGIC, the Australian Export Grains Innovation Centre. And I'd like to welcome you to the Australian Malting Barley for Ecuador, Peru, talking about quality, reliability and safety. This is the second webinar that the Australian grains industry has hosted for Ecuador and Peru. And it's terrific to be with you all again. It's been some time since our last webinar. This afternoon we have people that are registered from Ecuador, Peru, Australia, Malaysia, Chile. So we've got a great cross-sectional area of people that have registered for the event. In Australia, we're about ready to commence our harvest. So this is a prime opportunity for this webinar to our customers in Ecuador and Peru to talk about what the Australian grains industry looks like and what the harvest coming up for our 2022-2023 is going to be looking like. So today we've got a full packed program with various speakers. We're going to have all the speakers go through their presentations. We'll hold questions over to the end. This webinar is a fully simulated translated webinar. So for those that are joining, you can choose to listen to this webinar in your preferred language, be that in Spanish or English. So on the bottom of the Zoom function, you will see a global icon that says translation. Click on the global icon and then tick whether you want to listen to this in Spanish or English. Rightio. So we've got a lot to get through this webinar. So I'd like to introduce you to all the speakers that will be presenting today. If they could turn their cameras on, that would be great. So today we'll be hearing from, and we've changed the order up a little bit from the program, but we'll be hearing from Mr. Lloyd George. Lloyd has a career spanning greater than 30 years in the Australian grains industry and 13 years in the international trade market grains industry as well. Lloyd now concentrates his attention on building a grain information and analytical business here in Australia. Lloyd continues to write weekly grain articles for national newspaper, and Lloyd is an expert and is one of the main leaders in Australia training around grain market analysis and grain marketing. So welcome, Lloyd, to presenting again at the Australian Malting Barley webinar. Lloyd will be talking about Australian barley supplies for 2021-2022 and their season outlook for 2022-2023. Following Lloyd's presentation will be a presentation by myself, Mary Rains, from AGIC. So my role is to develop and provide technical content and market engagement activity to all customers of the Australian grains industry, or to all customers that buy Australian barley. Following my presentation, you'll hear from Ms. Alicia Vassos. So Alicia is the newly appointed classifications manager for Grains Australia. I'll just re-say that again. Alicia is the newly appointed classification manager, barley and coarse grains for Grains Australia, and the outgoing executive manager for Barley Australia. The new role for Grains Australia is responsible for managing the Malting Barley Accreditation Program and assisting with the development and building of the Oats Program. In June 2022, Barley Australia merged with Grains Australia. Under the merge, Grains Australia now takes responsible for all technical functions associated with barley variety classification, trade market and information and education on behalf of the Australian barley industry. So it's great to have Alicia Vassos back with us. Alicia's presentation is going to talk about the introduction of post-malting variety accreditation and support for customers. Following Alicia's presentation, you're going to hear from local talent, Marco Menza. Marco is the procurement raw supplies manager with AB InBev based in Lima, Peru. Welcome, Marco. It's great to have local talent on our Australian webinars. Marco has 4 years of experience in procurement, specialising in sourcing raw materials for Peru and Ecuador with AB InBev. Marco is a civil engineer by training and has project management in infrastructure, project development, efficiencies in supply chain in the region. We welcome Marco to provide insights about the quality and quantity forecasts of and trends within the Peru-Ecuador region for malting barley. Closing out our event today, we're going to hear from Ian Mortimer. G'day, Ian. It's terrific to have you here with us as well. So for those that don't know, Ian is currently the Australian Ag Councillor for South America and based in Chile. Ian has over 28 years as a senior career public servant with the Australian government, including the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment. Ian's also worked for the Australian Pesticide and Veterinary Medicine Authority. Ian has served as the Ag Councillor for the Australian High Commission into Delhi, and prior to commencing as the Australian Ag Councillor South America, Mr. Mortimer was the Director for Indonesia, Middle East, North Africa and South Asia. Mr. Mortimer has held numerous senior positions with the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, covering agri-foods, free trade agreements, biosecurity policies, emergency in response, and in a number of bilateral sections responsible for managing relationships with America, South Asia and East Asia. So Ian comes with a big credentials, and it has actually been fantastic to work with Ian in pulling off this and creating this webinar. And to welcome everybody here today, I'm really pleased to present to you the Australian Ambassador for Peru, Marie Ringland. Marie has had a career with the Australian government and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Prior to Peru as the ambassador, Ambassador Ringland was the director for Afghanistan Consul Support Unit. That would have been a very challenging role. And Ambassador Ringland has held positions in Beijing, China as the Deputy Head of Missions, and the Australian Ambassador Santiago de Chile. Welcome, Ambassador Ringland, to launch our webinar today.
Muchísimas gracias. Y es un gran honor estar aquí con ustedes. Un buen venido. Primero quisiera agradecer, y voy a decirlo en inglés, the Australian Export Grain Innovation Centre, con el apoyo también del the Australian Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, and también Austrade por el gran esfuerzo en organizar este webinar, que es la segunda vez en una serie. Y como hemos escuchado, tenemos presentadores muy expertos para hablar con ustedes sobre lo que ofrece Australia. Y quisiera también reconocer el gran sacrificio de ellos llamando de Australia, donde todavía es en la madrugada o muy, muy temprano en la mañana. Pero eso refleja el gran compromiso que Australia tiene en trabajar con ustedes aquí en Latinoamérica y en el Asia-Pacífico. Sobre Australia, quisiera decir unas pocas cosas. Australia tiene una reputación por la calidad, la seguridad y la confiabilidad. Llegué hoy día desde Arequipa con una feria de minería enorme. Y allá habían muchas botellas de cerveza cusqueña y cada uno tiene un poquito de Australia, la cebada de Australia. Eso es el principio. Quisiera aumentar este potencial y trabajar con ustedes más para tener más cebada afuera de Australia. Este webinar que tenemos hoy día va a darles un panorama de la perspectiva de la industria cebada. También la acreditación de cebada, la calidad y las tendencias por Perú y Ecuador, entre otros temas. Espero que sea muy interesante y útil para ustedes de Perú y Ecuador. Y ustedes puedan aprender más sobre la calidad, los estándares de la calidad y seguridad que ofrece y caracteriza la industria de Australia, y que marca a Australia como un país con una reputación para entregar productos de alta calidad y como un país de confiabilidad. Les invito también, siga trabajando para fortalecer nuestros vínculos entre Australia, Perú y Ecuador, y explorar también las posibilidades para fomentar más vínculos comerciales y de inversión para el beneficio de nuestros países. Que disfruten las presentaciones hoy día y por favor, búscame en la Embajada de Australia aquí en Lima si tiene interés, y también con los representantes del gobierno de Australia aquí en Perú. Especialmente quisiera marcar la presencia de Ian Mortimer en Santiago de Chile y señor John Prowse, también el representante de Austrade y sus equipos. Son los expertos aquí en la región Austrade y Department of Agriculture, Forestry y Fisheries. Aprovecha su presencia, tiene mucho para ofrecerles en combinación con la industria de Australia, y marca los detalles de todos los presentadores de hoy día. Ellos están aquí para ayudarles. Muchísimas gracias.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lloyd George. I'm a grain market analyst based in Australia, and today I'm going to be talking to you about Australian barley supplies for the 22-23 season. It's a pleasure to be with you, to viewers in South America today, as well as viewers we have from Australia and in parts of Asia as well. Oops, a little bit too quick there. Just a kind of a brief introduction to it. What we're looking at for the coming season. Harvest is just starting, very early stages. The earliest of the harvest in the most northern regions of Australia, including Queensland and Western Australia. We're assured of another large harvest. Some months ago, I was talking to some of you on a webinar, and I was speaking of the very large crop that we had harvested for the 2021-22 year. My messages today are going to be very similar to what I said then. We've had another excellent season, and that's going to allow for a big harvest, another large exportable surplus of Australian barley, and the expectation that Australian grain prices, barley prices, will remain competitive to ensure those large exportable supplies are moved into global markets, including South America. Now, what's made this season another very successful season for Australian farmers? It's been a wetter than normal winter crop season for us. The map on the left-hand side of the screen is a rainfall map from essentially the cropping period. Crops typically getting planted in April, and the growing season will continue through to October. The chart represents the April to August, end of August rainfall. and the blue is showing above average to much above average rainfall through the cropping areas. And the cropping areas, East Coast Australia, South Australia, and Western Australia there. And that is allowed for bumper crops. Australia will harvest in total winter crops. I'm expecting close on 55 million tonnes. It will be slightly down on last year, but still a very large cropping season by historical standards. We are now in the third La Nina season in a row, and La Ninas, whilst they do result in drier than normal conditions in parts of South America, it usually results in wetter than normal conditions in Australia, and that's exactly what we've seen. That is going to ensure that we see high yields for barley crops in Australia, and that will mean a barley crop in excess of 12 million tonnes. At the moment, ABARE is forecasting at about 12.2, 12.3 million tonnes, slightly down on last year, but historically another large crop. And as I said earlier, a harvest is already upon us in the northern areas. Barley will start to come in the next couple of weeks in Western Australia in the Geraldton zone, and the expectation is that all states will have above average yields, with some states having some exceptional yields. Just a little state recap on where the barley is produced and what it's going to be looking like in the 2022-23 season. I'll start off with Western Australia here on the left-hand side of the screen. Expecting a crop of close on 5 million tonnes of barley. That'll be down probably about 700,000 tonnes on last year. 3/4 of that crop will go for export. There is a large domestic malting industry in Western Australia, and that will consume just under the best part of 25% of the crop. Typically, about 18% of the crop will go malting grade. South Australia, expecting a crop of around about 2 million tonnes, possibly a little bit over 2 million tonnes. 20%, about a fifth of last year's crop was malting, and 85% of the total state production will head into export markets. Victoria will have a crop of around about 3.6 million tonnes. That's similar to last year. New South Wales will have a crop of about 2.5 million tonnes. Now that's slightly down, about 500,000 tonnes on last year. Now most of that barley there will be consumed in domestic markets. Some malting, but a lot of that going into feed. And then in Queensland, they'll have a crop of around about 400,000 tonnes, which will all be consumed for domestic, mostly feed. So as you can see, the bulk of the exports are going to be coming from Western Australia, South Australia, and Victoria. Now, just a little bit of discussion about the global barley dynamics for 2022-23 season. As I've said, Australia, we're on track for another big crop, slightly down on last year's crop. And the numbers that I've got up in front of the United States Department of Agriculture. But what we are seeing there is that we're seeing a similar crop to last year. But there are a couple of notable changes in there that we have seen. There's been a recovery in the Canadian barley crop compared to last year. We've also seen a recovery in production in some of the countries that were large barley importers last year, and namely Turkey, which was a considerable barley importer through the 2021-22 year, and the Iranian crop, who were also kind of sizable importers last year. That's also improved. Just a little bit of discussion on the demand size, as to changes that we're seeing there. Saudi Arabia and China, the two largest barley importers in the world. Saudi Arabian barley imports are expected to be slightly up on last year, but still well down from those 1920 and the 2020 and the 2020-21 levels. China is expected to be up on last year, and the Turkish imports are expected to be well down on last year. Australian barley prices are expected to remain competitive through the season. And the reason for that is that the need to move exports with another large crop. You'll see historically the Australian barley prices back in the 1920 area were above world prices, and that was because of drought in Australia. But now, after on our third consecutive large harvest, those prices need to remain competitive and to buy market share around the world, and that's the expectation for the 20-23 season, and that will allow Australian barley exports to penetrate into countries around the world, as it has been doing in recent years. Now, just a bit of a breakdown on where those barley exports have been heading. The data that I've put in front of us, that you're seeing here at the moment on the charts, is from Australia's Bureau of Statistics. The chart on the right shows the marked increase that we've seen as Australia's moved from drought into large crops. In the where we had exports in the 1920 season of a little over 3 million tonnes, and then in the 2021 we jumped right up to 8 million tonnes. That's based on a October to September marketing year, and we're in the 21-22 season. We're expected to be a little bit down below that, but still, significantly higher, more than double where we were in the drought years. So, and as you could see, that on the countries where that's going, where Saudi Arabia has been the dominant importer, but as well as large exports into Japan and other Asian areas, but as well, we're starting to see those South American countries come into there, and that is namely malting barley. Now, the chart on the right-hand side is a little bit more of a detailed breakdown, and that gives us a specific idea of the which countries it's actually going to. Most notable difference between the 1920 and the 2021 and 21-22 on the destinations is the absence of China. In 1920 season, China was the dominant importer. That's no longer the case. China has essentially prohibited Australian barley imports. That barley is now going into other destinations. As you can see, Saudi Arabia has been one of the major beneficiary, but also going into other countries as well. As mentioned, Saudi, Japan, but also a lot of barley going into Asia as a feed grain. Middle Eastern countries, which will typically import barley, but also we're starting to see now here malting barley going into South America, Mexico, as well as other countries, Peru and Ecuador, which is very pleasing to see from Australia's perspective. Now, just recapping and leaving you with some messages today before I hand over to our next speaker. Third consecutive La Nina in a row has resulted in a third consecutive large barley crop in Australia for the 22-23 season. Now, this is going to allow large barley exports, probably in around about 6.5 million tonnes, with a chance of more, but demand allowing. Australian barley prices are set to remain competitive for the for the 22-23 season, to allow for those large exportable supplies and to move them into global markets. Saudi Arabia is expected to remain Australia's largest importer, as it has been for the past 2 seasons. China continues to exclude Australian barley, and there's nothing on the horizon to say that is about to change. Exports to other Middle Eastern countries will remain large. Mexico is set to will import around about 330,000 tonnes of Australian barley in the 21-22 season, with about 120,000 tonnes going into other South American countries. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to answer questions a little bit later on in the session. But now I'll be handing over to our next speaker.
Thank you, Lloyd. It was a great overview of the Australian grains industry and our Australian barley industry, and where we're looking to for the 2022 season. As you said, it's the next, it's the third La Nina that we've had. So my name again, Mary Rains. My presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Australian Export Grains Innovation Centre, provide a little bit of an overview of the Australian grains industry, talk about the 2022 Australian grain production areas, and more importantly, focus on the Australian barley varieties that are sown across Australia in 2022 and 2023, and then also look at the production trends of Australian barley varieties. So for those that have joined us online that aren't familiar with AGIC, the Australian Export Grains Innovation Centre, We're an independent, non-for-profit company. So we're funded by the Australian government and the Australian grains growers. We were established in 2012 to increase the value of the Australian grains industry. And we work across all grain crops of wheat, barley, oats, canola, to a lesser degree, sorghum and pulses. So wherever Australia exports grain to, AGIC is the lead in the technical engagement activities and assists Grains Australia with that trade market access and trade market development. AGIC have offices, being a national organisation, we have offices in Perth on the west coast of Australia and then also in Sydney. At these locations, we have research laboratories that include a pilot milling and pilot bakery. We have a team of markets insights people and a team of economists. So we work together with the Australian grains industry to add value to customers of the Australian grains. Now, you've had a great presentation from Lloyd talking about the Australian grains industry and where we're heading to and what we're tracking with. Just to recap on that, when you look at the Australian grain, as Lloyd said, we're in for another big year. This is our third production year. The grain in Australia, you can see that barley is the second most important grain crop grown in Australia, followed by wheat, to a lesser degree, canola, and grain, legumes and pulses. So it's estimated that, there's going to be a production of over 55 million total tonnes of grain in Australia. Last year was our biggest production of grain, where we produced just under 62 million tonnes of grain. But as you can see, our long-term average in the Australian grains industry is around 47 million metric tonnes. You've seen this slide with Lloyd George just previously. This slide gives you an indication where barley is grown in Australia. Just recapping on what Lloyd said, we're predicted to produce just under 3 million tonnes of barley, around 12.5 million metric tonnes. The map of Australia, the red dots are our ports. The green shaded areas where barley is grown. As mentioned before, you've got Western Australia is a net exporter of barley, followed by South Australia and Victoria. And the barley in Queensland and New South Wales is used both for export and domestic consumption. You would have heard in Lloyd's presentation that the harvest is starting to kick off, and he mentioned Geraldton. Geraldton's based over here on the west coast, up near this dot point, a red dot point at the port there. So you can see Australia is just under 4,000 kilometres east-west. We grow plant over just over 4 million metric tonnes, or 4 million hectares of barley annually across a diverse growing region. So our harvest will start in October and end in January. What I think will be interested for those people online today is what barley varieties Australia are growing, because you know that barley varieties all perform differently under whether they're a high extract or a high fermentability, low extract, whether they respond to GA, whether they require what their adjuncts be, that with sugar, cane sugar or other starches. So can I just draw your eye to 2022? And this will give you an indication of the estimated percentage of barley varieties grown nationally. You can see that the two dominant barley varieties grown in Australia currently are the variety Spartacus and the globally accredited barley variety RGT Planet. We've seen an increase in the barley variety of Maximus in the light green areas take up production areas across Australia. This is a variety that's been recently released and is starting to bulk up. So this is an indication of our barley varieties that are being planted. Also, the top area called barley varieties others are varieties that are being bulked up or varieties that are being superseded. But for procurement people, for marketers, for technical people that want to use barley varieties and have different barley varieties for different brewing styles, and this gives you an indication of what's being grown across Australia. and whether that variety will be grown there into the future. So when we look at what's happening in the Australian barley forecast trends, this slide up here looks at the forecast trends of Australian barley varieties planted. Now, this is an estimated of barley varieties and their planting regions nationally in Australia. So we can see, if I cast your eye to 2024, we can see that the major barley varieties that are going to be planted in Australia in 2024 will be RGT Planet. You'll see an increase in the area of Maximus, our newly accredited malting barley variety. You'll see a decrease in the production of Spartacus, so it will drop down to below 20%. Currently, it's sitting over 30%. You'll see there'll be an increase in other. So other, as I said, is varieties that are being bulked up, varieties that are being superseded, or varieties that don't have that 30% market share, but still do have value in being grown in different agronomic regions, but also have quality attributes for maltsters and brewers. We can see that there'll be an increase in a new barley variety called Commodus. So this slide, I think, adds great value to procurement, to brewers and maltsters when you're looking at that forward planning of purchasing barley varieties, because we know it costs a lot of money to evaluate barley varieties in malting and also in for the brewing style. So this is a perfect example of what you could forecast for. So just finishing in my presentation, I wanted to demonstrate that Australia produces a range of barley varieties that suit various malting and brewing quality requirements. The forecast trends in barley varieties assist in that business planning, that procurement, that forecasting of purchasing. Barley in Australia is the second largest grain crop to wheat, so it's around that 20% of the market. Australia is a net exporter of barley, and as what you heard from Lloyd, we're on track to produce over 12.5 million tonnes. We use 3 million tonnes domestically, so we're going to have that net export around 7 to 8 million metric tonnes. And the outlook for the Australian barley industry for 2022, 2023, tonnage wise, is very favourable. So thank you very much for your attention during my short presentation, but I just want to send home a message, a take-home message, that no matter what the requirement, there is an Australian malting barley variety that suits your needs. So thank you. And now I would like to pass over to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Alicia Vassos from Grains Australia.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks very much for the invitation to talk today. My name is Alicia, and I'm the Executive Manager for Barley. So I was the Executive Manager for Barley Australia before Barley Australia merged with Grains Australia, and now I'm the Classification Manager for Barley and Coarse Grains. And I'm going to talk about the post-accreditation support for customers. So today I'm going to give you a quick update on what's been happening in the Malting Barley Accreditation Program. I will provide you a brief overview, give you a snapshot of the current entries in our program, and then I'll talk a little bit more about our post-varietal accreditation support. In our previous presentation, we focused fairly heavily on explaining our Malting Barley Accreditation Program. So I will not go into that level of detail today, other than reminding people that there are 2 stages to our accreditation program, and that it will take a minimum of 2 years for a new submission to be granted accreditation. For anyone new joining today's webinar and you would like to know more, you can view this schematic representation of the Barley accreditation process and access further information on the Barley Australia website. Even though we've recently merged with Grains Australia, we still have all that information available on the Barley Australia website. We are also happy to answer any questions via email at a later point if you'd like to know more. So whilst I'm not going to go through the program in any depth, I did want to highlight a few points. Pilot malting was a recent addition to our accreditation program, with last year being the third year we utilised pilot malting in stage 1 of the program. And we consider that it is essential to the program structure. As is the commercial malting part of the program, which is utilised in stage 2. We are very grateful for the support we have of the maltsters here in Australia that provide the malting of the batches required for the stage 2 part of our program. That too is critical to the design of our program. By having pilot malting and commercial data, we have a body of technical information to provide to the MBIBTC, which is a technical subcommittee of Barley Australia, which assists with the accreditation process. It means we can provide a good body of information back to the industry to help with variety adoption, which I'll talk a little bit more about later in this presentation. By doing this in our program, we can support the long-term profitability for our growers and the wider barley industry, and of course, providing excellent varieties for the market and for you as maltsters and brewers, as customers of Australia Grain. We continue to get feedback that having a malting barley accreditation program is important and widely sought after. So to that effect, we work very hard within the industry to make sure we're providing a world-class accreditation service back to the industry. Now I briefly want to talk about some of the varieties that are in the program. Earlier this year, we reviewed the varieties going through the 2021 accreditation program, and there were 2 varieties that were in stage 2 that were accredited as malting barley varieties. One was Kiwi from Malt Europe, and the second Bottler from Grain Search. As you can see, they have different environments in which they grow, one high rainfall and one medium rainfall. And they have different fermentability ranges as well. These varieties are likely to be more targeted at the domestic malting and brewing environment. But having said that, they may go wider than that. And if you would like to find out more information, there is some further details at the bottom of the slide, which you should have access to a bit later on. And then you can follow up with those individual companies. So this is the program coming up through stage 1 in 2022. I'm not going to read all these varieties out. As you can see, there's a few in there. But again, they are targeted at different growing regions in Australia. We have quite a diverse range of growing environments in Australia and a very large country with a number of different agronomic zones. So these varieties are covering different growing regions. Some of these varieties will be grown across the country, while others will be targeted to smaller, more specific regions, like high rainfall areas, for example. They also cover a range of fermentability and DP attributes as well. And there are a couple of new varieties that are thought to have a non-glycosidic nitrile trait, the non-GN trait, which could be of interest for the distilling market. And this slide shows the entries coming through into stage 2 this year. These varieties have a range of agronomic attributes, from medium rainfall to more niche specific areas of acid soil tolerance. Buff has the acid soil tolerance, and we also have an IMI-tolerant variety, Commodus. Again, these varieties have a range of fermentabilities, and Buff and Commodus will be going through their final year assessment this year for stage 2. A few varieties, unfortunately, didn't have commercial quantities of grain available for harvest from the harvest that has just been, and were unable to continue their journey through this year's program. These varieties again, have a different range of agronomic and malt quality attributes, and will be continuing their journey in stage 2 next year and some in the year after. So now I just want to set the scene before I talk a little bit more about our post-accreditation and support initiative. So you would all be familiar with this, but I thought I should try and summarise in a few key points about what happens to our new variety post-accreditation. Obviously, there's a lot more complexity to it than summarised here, developing new varieties in the marketplace. Well, firstly, it requires customers for large volumes of grain to be grown. However, customers are only going to trial smaller quantities of grain, and you will all go through your own in-house approval processes, which is a normal process to happen. Just because we accredit the variety for malting and brewing doesn't mean that it has the right fit in your malting and brewing styles. So of course, you as customers of the grain will be testing it and approving them with your own in-house trial procedures. But growers often want guaranteed market, and they want malt premiums to scale up to large volumes. And the maltsters, of course, require reasonable tonnages to be available of the grain to be sure that they get the malt specification selection opportunity for the grain being grown. And I'm assuming you'd all be familiar with the expression that we have a chicken and the egg situation. And that is, it is a bit of a challenge to get it right in the early days of releasing a new variety. We're definitely not saying that we have all the answers to those problems, but we certainly do consider and talk about ways we can help support the industry after we accredit these new varieties. So this brings me to our post-accreditation market support that we've been working on for newly accredited varieties that have not yet been established in the market. We have the benefit of being able to process smaller samples when we have space in our program through the Pilot Malting Australia for evaluation. And we also have the benefit at times, if available, access to commercial information shared in confidence with Barley Australia that then gives us an overall average from a set of data to be used in this concept. So the idea is to have this information made available to the industry and customers in the form of a malt performance summary. So just to update you on our progress, we have been working on what we call Tier 1 or first level of the malt performance summary, which is for very new varieties which have just been accredited and often have very limited data sets. So we have a first release ready for a new variety called Maximus, which Mary discussed earlier. And I have an example on the next page. We have only recently just released this. It's our first malt performance summary that's now available on our website. And for the second tier or level 2 malt performance summaries, we are still working on a suitable format to present more detailed statistics with larger data sets. But obviously it takes time to build up those data sets for those new varieties. So this is still under development. So here is our Maximus malt performance summary. Sorry if it's a little small on your screens, but it's really just to give you some basic malt quality information and a few comments about its overall performance. As you can appreciate, the data is very limited, and you can see that we have 12 data points for Maximus versus our benchmark that we're comparing it against, which has 147 data points. It's giving an indication of the malt performance, and this is non-commercially sensitive information that can be shared with customers of Australian barley to assist in providing more information at the time of people starting to use these new varieties. We are hoping that this will be helpful, and we certainly look forward to any comments or questions about this. And just to finish off, I'd like to let you know that we welcome your feedback on these malt performance summaries. And We also want to hear from you about any information that you're looking for. So if you wish to get in contact with me, please contact me via my email. And thank you for your attention. And now I'd like to hand you over to the next speaker, Marco.
Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Qué tal? A ver si esto está funcionando. Sí, listo. Bueno, primero buenas tardes con todos. Agradecer a la embajada por la oportunidad de realizar esta pequeña presentación. Mi nombre es Marco Galarza y bueno, aquí tenemos la agenda de los puntos que estaré tocando en este PPT. Primero presentar un poco la compañía a la que vengo a representar. Luego hablar sobre cuáles son nuestros requerimientos de cebada. También traemos lo que son las proyecciones del consumo de cebada para este año, cuáles han sido las tendencias de crecimiento y los próximos años hacia adelante. Finalmente hablaré un poco sobre las oportunidades que hemos identificado y que vemos como consumidores en ese negocio. Ok. En primer lugar, contarles que representa la compañía InBev. Esta es la cervecera más grande del mundo. El propósito de nuestra empresa, el cual ha sido relanzado recientemente, es el que pueden leer aquí justamente, ¿no? Es: soñamos en grande para crear un futuro con más motivos para brindar. Nosotros somos personas apasionadas de nuestros proyectos, disfrutamos enfrentando nuevos retos, explorando alternativas para generar valor y siempre aportar al crecimiento de la empresa. Así que siempre nos encontrarán, dispuestos a analizar cualquier propuesta, planteamiento, cualquier cosa que pueda llegar a nuestra mesa. InBev, como les comento, es la primera cervecera a nivel global. Tenemos presencia en más de 100 países con nuestras marcas. En gran cantidad de ellos se trata de una presencia de liderazgo en el sector. Son cerca de 170.000 colaboradores los que desarrollan nuestras operaciones, que se realizan o están instaladas en 50 países. La empresa se ha planteado exigentes metas de sostenibilidad en un plazo relativamente corto, que es hacia el 2025. Está, digamos, a la vuelta de la esquina. Y cuando entramos a ver y analizar estas metas, podemos ver que muchas de ellas ya están encaminadas, están con un gran avance. Dentro de las metas hay pilares interesantes, como por ejemplo lo que es la agricultura inteligente, donde trabajamos con comunidades de pequeños agricultores y los ayudamos a desarrollar procedimientos de trabajo más tecnificados, les brindamos un acceso al crédito, les damos capacitación técnica, les damos seguimiento durante todo el proceso de la cosecha, información valiosa, con la finalidad de que puedan entregar cultivos de alta calidad. Y esto lo hacemos con agricultores de cebada, maíz, arroz, yuca, etcétera, en muchísimos países, ¿no? Particularmente yo tengo la suerte de ver este proyecto en Perú para maíz y en Ecuador lo hacemos con cebada. También trabajamos en la gestión del agua. Colaboramos con el cuidado y la puesta en valor de fuentes de agua convencionales y no convencionales, como pozos o también incluso el mantenimiento de canales ancestrales de la época de nuestros antepasados, los incas. El agua es uno de los principales ingredientes para la cerveza y conocemos el valor que tiene como insumo para toda la humanidad, por lo que somos conscientes de nuestra responsabilidad a este respecto. Trabajamos en empaque circular, buscamos completar el ciclo de todos nuestros materiales. Se trabaja con vidrio, cartón, papel, etc. ¿Sí? Yendo de la mano con nuestros principales proveedores para poder aprovecharlos al máximo. Y también acción climática, ¿no? Somos conscientes de la crisis climática por lo que estamos atravesando y estamos enfocados en cumplir con objetivos muy específicos de reducción de emisiones y reducción de consumo de recursos como la energía, en donde buscamos un cambio a una energía 100% sostenible. Y bien, como les comenté, bueno, yo particularmente estoy encargado de lo que son las operaciones, la compra de materia prima para las operaciones de Perú y Ecuador. Y la presencia de AB InBev en estos dos países es a través de dos importantes empresas cerveceras, que son Unión de Cervecerías Peruanas, Bacus y yo son en Perú, y Cervecería Nacional en Ecuador. En Perú, Bacus es una de las principales y más admiradas compañías del país, es líder del mercado. Contamos con una producción anual de cerveza de cerca de 14 millones de hectolitros, las cuales producimos a través de nuestras 6 plantas, están ubicadas a lo largo de todo el territorio. Y con respecto a nuestra capacidad maltera, tenemos una planta productora de malta, lo usamos para producir malta base o malta pilsner, está ubicada en la ciudad de Lima, en una zona que se llama Ñaño. Esta planta se abastece de cebada a través de cargamentos que llegan al puerto del Callao. Es el principal puerto del país. Y esta maltería puede producir hasta cerca de 100.000 toneladas de malta al año. ¿Sí? Esto, sin embargo, es menor que la capacidad de malta que vamos a necesitar para nuestra producción de cerveza. Entonces nos deja un déficit de cerca de 50.000 toneladas de malta, que también importamos, pero ya como malta producida. De ese detalle de cuánto importamos por año voy a hablar un poco más adelante. Y luego Ecuador, que tiene una historia similar, a través de Cervecería Nacional, es también una de las compañías más preciadas del país. Tiene una reconocida historia, marcas muy apreciadas por los consumidores ecuatorianos. Y ahí contamos con 2 plantas productoras de cerveza. Están ubicadas en las principales ciudades, Guayaquil y Quito. Y también tenemos una maltería que está en Guayaquil, la ciudad portuaria, por donde se abastece la cebada. Nuestra maltería aquí puede producir cerca de unas 33.000 toneladas de malta, malta base también. Y en este caso también nos toca importar, en Ecuador importamos alrededor de 17.000 toneladas adicionales para poder cumplir con la cuota que necesitamos para la producción de cerveza. Ecuador produce unos 5.5 millones de hectolitros de cerveza al año. Ok. Aquí les quiero contar un poquito por qué o cómo utilizamos la cebada en nuestras operaciones, ¿no? Tal vez algunos ya sepan esto, pero voy a entrar un poco al detalle. Como ya lo pueden saber algunos, hay insumos básicos para producir una cerveza. ¿Cuáles son los insumos que utilizamos en nuestras cervezas? Pues principalmente, o lo básico es el lúpulo. El lúpulo regula amargor, aroma, el agua, la levadura y la malta. Estos 2 últimos insumos son los que inician pues, el proceso químico en el que el líquido ya comienza a fermentarse y se produce alcohol, ¿no? Y empezamos el proceso de la producción de cerveza. Entonces, siendo la malta uno de los 4 insumos principales de nuestros líquidos, debemos asegurarnos que tenga la calidad de vida. Y la malta viene a ser pues, justamente, ¿no?, la cebada llevada por un proceso de germinación inicial, en donde se activa la capacidad de la misma para poder trabajar en conjunto con la levadura en todo el proceso de fermentación. Entonces, ¿qué es lo que buscamos en una cebada de calidad para nuestros procesos? De acuerdo a lo que comentan nuestros expertos cerveceros, son estas principales condiciones, las que nombro aquí. La cáscara de la cebada. ¿Para qué nos sirve esto? La suficiente cáscara debería proteger el embrión de la pérdida de sustancias solubles, ¿sí? Y asimismo protegerlo ante el ingreso de microorganismos durante el proceso de germinación que se realiza en la maltería. Luego es importante el potencial enzimático, debe tener una alta capacidad para sintetizar enzimas, debe tener una adecuada tasa entre almidón y proteínas, un alto contenido de almidón y una cantidad de proteínas y enzimas adecuadas. También una baja temperatura de gelatinización, que debería alcanzar su máximo a los 65 grados, y un contenido adecuado de lípidos, ya que estos materiales reducen el riesgo de oxidación. De todas estas características, las más importantes o las que más se recalcan por los cerveceros al momento de consultar con ellos para las compras son el tema del potencial enzimático y los contenidos de almidón y proteínas, ¿no? Son en los que más nos fijamos, podría decirse. Toda la cebada que recibimos, tanto en Perú como en Ecuador, siempre es almacenada en silos externos. No tenemos capacidad propia para almacenar toda esa cebada. Y desde ahí es enviar las malterías progresivamente para el proceso, ¿no? Luego ya en la maltería hacemos un proceso de limpieza adicional, clasificación y un almacenamiento mínimo que es previo al proceso de malteo. Luego la cebada pasa por las malterías en el proceso ya de lo que es el remojo, la germinación y el secado. Aquí la idea es, como comenté anteriormente, ya activar esta cebada para que empiece a germinar, ¿no? Y esté lista para entrar a lo que es el proceso de la cerveza. Okay, entonces, ahora quiero compartir con ustedes lo que son las proyecciones de consumo para los próximos años. Aquí armé un pequeño cuadro en donde podemos ver lo que han sido nuestros consumos desde el 2020 y lo que va a ser el consumo para el próximo año. Sí, podemos ver claramente que en el 2020 hubo una reducción importante del consumo, producto de la pandemia, por supuesto, pero luego hemos venido recuperando nuestras capacidades, ¿no? Ya llevándolo a niveles más estables y llevando nuestras plantas malteras al máximo de su producción. Para el próximo año también esperamos mantener nuestras plantas al máximo. Como pueden ver, en la parte izquierda está nuestro consumo de cebada, de nuestras plantas malteras. Entonces, este año y el próximo año vamos a mantenerlas al máximo, como les comenté. En Perú son 117.000, casi 118.000 toneladas por año de producción, de consumo de cebada, perdón. Esas son las 100.000 toneladas de malta. Y en Ecuador son 40.000 toneladas de consumo de cebada. Y en la parte derecha están los volúmenes de malta que vamos a necesitar importar adicionalmente debido a la limitante de producción que tenemos, ¿no? Nuestra única limitante actualmente para consumir más cebada por ahora es la capacidad de nuestras plantas malteras. Esto es en ambos casos, para las cuales no hay a corto plazo una visual de algún plan de expansión, aunque ambas sí tienen la capacidad para crecer y seguramente en los próximos años lo haré, ¿no? Justamente es para compensar esta falta de capacidad que venimos comprando malta base importada con un crecimiento, sí, ahí importante, ¿no? En la malta base que traemos es donde pueden ver, donde se ve el crecimiento del consumo que viene de nuestro crecimiento de ventas. Para el 2023 vemos volúmenes estables con ligeros crecimientos. Cabe recalcar que aquí lo que tenemos son cálculos provisionales para el 2023. El proceso del desarrollo del plan para el próximo año todavía podría tener cambios, sigue en desarrollo, pero por ahora es el mejor escenario que manejamos. Adicional a este escenario de maltas bases, también consumimos otros productos a los que llamamos maltas especiales. Los usamos en alguna cerveza puntual, ¿no? Por ejemplo, en nuestra cerveza cusqueña trigo, utilizamos trigo malteado, donde consumimos cerca de 10.000 toneladas de trigo malteado al año. También utilizamos otras maltas como malta caramelo, malta tostada, Munich, Budweiser, extracto de malta incluso, entre otras, pero ya mucha menor cantidad, ¿no? Esas son las principales. Y finalmente también quería aprovechar el espacio para poder hacer un recuento de algunas oportunidades que hemos identificado de cara a futuras negociaciones de compra de malta y cebada de Australia específicamente. Actualmente el contexto es apropiado para el abastecimiento desde Australia. Sin embargo, creo que es importante mencionar estos temas con la finalidad de poder mantener siempre la competitividad, ¿no? Incluso a pesar de los nuevos cambios que puedan ocurrir, quién sabe, la geopolítica pueda seguirse moviendo, los cambios climáticos, etc. En primer lugar, vemos oportunidad en las capacidades logísticas en origen. ¿sí? Y con esto me refiero principalmente a capacidades de almacenamiento que tal vez nos puedan brindar una mayor flexibilidad de nuestras ventanas de carga. Esto porque nosotros particularmente, como traemos tanto malta como cebada en barcos compartidos, cargamos en 2 puertos por lo general. Entonces muchas veces es complicado organizar las agendas en ventanas estrechas de tiempo. También es importante lo que es la capacidad de los puertos, la capacidad de atención de los puertos. Sabemos que estamos en un contexto global en donde la logística de puertos es muy complicada. Justamente por eso creo que es algo a lo que hay que ponerle bastante ojo. En las últimas cargas hemos notado sí colas de espera bastante largas en nuestras embarcaciones, justamente por algunos problemas de atención. Y más allá de los costos en demoraje que esto pueda generar, la gran preocupación, el principal problema, como lo vemos nosotros, es el riesgo por desabastecimiento de producto. Nosotros tenemos políticas de inventario bastante estrictas. Solemos planear llegadas muy a tiempo de nuestras naves, con días de inventario muy específicos. Entonces, si se incrementan los tiempos de espera en origen de la carga, nuestras coberturas comienzan a caer por debajo de lo que llamamos inventario de seguridad. Nuestras operaciones se ponen en alerta roja y ya se vuelve un problema grave, ¿no? De hecho, es algo que nos ha sucedido este año y podría llevarnos a necesitar compras adicionales, ¿no? En segundo lugar, y bueno, esto tiene que ver también con lo que comentaba anteriormente, el tiempo de tránsito desde Australia hasta nuestros puertos es bastante largo. Si no me equivoco, deben ser alrededor de 2 meses, ¿no? En comparación con otros orígenes como Argentina, por ejemplo, ¿no? En ese sentido, si bien es cierto, no hay manera de cortar el tránsito de una nave, vuelvo a recalcar la importancia de atenciones oportunas, ¿no? En los puertos y capacidad de puerto para poder reducir estos riesgos. También, en tercer lugar, traigo lo que es las homologaciones, lo que nosotros llamamos homologaciones. Importante trabajar de cara al futuro, adelantarnos a procesos de homologación, tanto de nuevas variedades de cebada como de plantas malteras, porque como comentaba, nosotros importamos mucha malta ya procesada, entonces para esto no solamente tenemos que homologar el producto de la cebada o la malta, sino también el site, la planta, ¿sí? Esto requiere bastante trabajo de nuestros especialistas de calidad, mucho tiempo de por medio, de los expertos cerveceros también. Además, se requiere el envío de muestras. Solamente el tránsito de estas muestras puede demorar varios meses. Así que aquí pongo esto también sobre la mesa y sugiero trabajar muy proactivamente y adelantar toda posibilidad de cambios, modificaciones u oportunidades que vayamos a tener en el producto o en las fábricas hacia adelante, ¿sí? Y finalmente, mencionar lo que es la cooperación, ¿no? Importante tener espacios como este, intercambio de información. Ya habíamos tenido antes también algunas conversaciones con representantes de la embajada, en una visita que nos hicieron. También les habíamos contado ya de programas que tenemos locales de agricultura, con pequeños agricultores, tanto en Perú como en Ecuador. Y bueno, estamos pues muy abiertos a cualquier posibilidad de trabajo en conjunto con este tema o cualquier otro, con la finalidad de seguir estrechando los lazos y desarrollando una relación comercial saludable. Bien, eso sería por mi parte. Muchas gracias. Aquí les dejo mi correo para cualquier consulta y les cedo el paso a Mary.
Thank you very much, Marco. It was great to have you present to the Australian grains industry, but also to your Ecuador colleagues and Peru colleagues as well. We're now going to roll into the Q&A section. So if all speakers, including Ian, could turn on their cameras. Marco, can you call your camera back on? Then we're going to roll into the Q&A session now. So thank you very much. It was a Great presentation by all. Now, if anybody has any questions, can they please put it into the Q&A section there on the Zoom function? We're monitoring that and we'll be able to interpretate the questions if they come in Spanish and or English. Okay, so I just have, just bear with me for a minute. Quiet. I just got a few questions here that have come in. So Lloyd, a question to you. Do you see you talked about the Australian grain season, talked about the big production season, talked about the third La Nina season. Do you see that the Australia is wetter than normal year and the growing season will have an impact on quality of the year of barley that's going to be harvested this year?
Good question, Mary. The wetter than normal weather, I think it's probably slowing farmer sales down, uncertain of how that quality is going to be. I think the biggest impact is actually going to be the weather through the harvest period, and so that will be do farmers get a drier October, November than what we've actually seen in September that allows them to harvest the grain quality, the grain at that time in relatively good fine conditions, a quick harvest and limit the chance of quality downgrading during that harvest window. Weather forecasts are problematic. The Bureau is forecasting a continuation of that wet weather. More so on the East Coast and the West Coast. So maybe Western Australia and even parts of South Australia will be spared, which would be good. As I pointed out in the presentation, that's where the bulk of the exports actually come from. So I think that would be the positive slant on it. It remains to be seen. I think last year showed that we can have La Nina seasons and we still get good quality grain coming from that.
Thanks, Lloyd. You're right. Like the La Nina looks like it's on the East Coast, won't happen on the West Coast, and that's where the West Coast and South Australia are net exporters, and they've started harvest now, and the temperature is already up around 30 degrees Celsius, and so looks like for a dry season. So thanks, Lloyd. I'm just going to go into Alicia. You talked about the Australian barley varieties, and it takes 2 years for accreditation. Why does it take 2 years to accreditate barley varieties?
Thank you, Mary. Well, it actually takes a minimum of 2 years. But as you can tell from my presentation, sometimes this process can be pushed out to 2023 and 2024 simply because the commercial quantities of grain are not available. So before we revamped the program, both stage 1 and stage 2 required commercial quantities of grain for malting. Now we have stage 1 that involves pilot malting, so smaller quantities of grain are required. But the reason why we still have 2 stages is to see how the grain responds under different environmental conditions. It's beneficial to do this so that we can see how the grain performs under drought conditions versus a year of good rainfall like this year, or examine how it performs under a hot finish. Ideally, we would want varieties that would perform well under all these conditions. So the reason why it takes 2 years, that's the reason why it takes 2 years, but by having pilot malting for the first year, we can process smaller volumes of grain, and whilst in the second year, we can determine how the variety performs in a commercial malt house. So by having 2 years of data, we can make an informed decision about the malt quality characteristics of the new line coming through. And having 2 years of data under different environmental conditions also adds to the robustness of the program.
Yeah, and the robustness of the data. That's great. You did talk about in your presentation the malt performance summary. So you've got customers that are buying Australian barley, and you know, maltsters and brewers want to know what the quality specs are for malting and brewing. You've put up a malt performance summary of Maximus. do you have any other malt specification summaries of other barley varieties in Australia? And if so, where do people access that material from?
So unfortunately, this is our first, the Maximus is our first malt performance summary, and it's available on the Barley Australia website. And we won't be going back to doing already released varieties. So most commercial maltsters and grains traders already have good knowledge of the performance of these varieties, but we'll be creating summaries for most of the new varieties that are accredited moving forward, subject obviously to enough data being available in the appropriate time frame.
Thanks, Alicia, because I would think people like Marco and Marco's team and even his competitors would actually get great value out of understanding what the Australian barley varieties, how they malt, and what their quality characteristics are for brewing as well. So, Marco, over to you. What sort of malting, when we talked about malting barley varieties and their quality, what sort of quality are you looking for, or varieties that you're looking for in AB InBev, and what's Ecuador, Peru looking for?
Sí. Actualmente nosotros estamos utilizando cebada Spartacus desde Australia. Hemos utilizado muchas variedades a través de los años, hemos ido cambiando. Hemos utilizado Andrea, Shakira, etcétera, Planet. Importante que tenga las características que mencioné, ¿no? en la presentación: nivel de proteína, ¿no? Potencial enzimático, y estamos abiertos a explorar cualquier nueva variedad. Solamente hay que considerar, como también indiqué, que estos tiempos de homologación de una nueva variedad pueden ser bastante largos, ¿no? Entonces, para hacer un cambio de una variedad a otra, sí necesitamos un tiempo adecuado para que nuestros especialistas de calidad puedan hacer las pruebas necesarias.
Thanks, Marco, for those insights there. You mentioned like new varieties, if you were to do accreditation and assess them for AB InBev, what's the minimum requirement of quantity that you would like of those new barley varieties coming through, if you were to assess them?
Normalmente traemos cerca de 200 toneladas para hacer una prueba, en pruebas grandes, industriales ya. Empezamos tal vez con fichas técnicas, luego pruebas pequeñas, ¿no? Pero ya para la prueba industrial sí se necesita un lote grande de cerca de 200 toneladas.
Thanks, Marco, because I think you said that the Peru requires 118,000 tons of barley. Is that what you import?
Sí, cerca de 120,000 toneladas.
Yeah, so you would like 200,000 tons of malting barley varieties to do new evaluations in AB InBev. Excellent, Marco. And you're importing malt, Marco. While I'm with you, Marco, you're importing malt barley varieties. Can you see a big growth in that malt area, like the processed malt, or you will be seeing growth in primary barley as malting barley? Where's the growth there, malting or malt?
El crecimiento del consumo de cebada viene un poco de la mano del crecimiento del consumo de cerveza. La compra de cebada como producto, como comenté en la presentación, viene un poco limitada por nuestra capacidad para producir malta, ¿no? Nuestra maltería. Entonces, digamos que esos volúmenes de cebada deberían mantenerse estables, las compras de cebada deberían mantenerse estables, porque no tenemos capacidad para maltear más, hasta que nuestra maltería pueda expandirse. Eso puede tomar algunos años. Lo que debería crecer es la compra de malta, ¿no? La compra de malta ya producida. Ahí sí vemos crecimientos que van de la mano con el crecimiento de nuestra venta de cerveza. Para el próximo año, si no me equivoco, el crecimiento es de cerca de 5 o 6% con respecto al 2022.
Okay, thanks, Marco. Just confirming, somebody asked me how long is the shipping between Australia to Peru? I think it takes around 21 days. So I'm going to lead into, so Ian Mortimer's there, so he'll be providing the final wrap-ups to this presentation. But Ian, you've been instrumental in some of the work that Australia's been doing into Latin America and Central America with barley. Can you just explain to the people online, what is the role of the Australian Government Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry in supporting trade, and what assistance can Austrade provide to potential importers and exporters of Australian barley?
Sure, thanks, Mary. So I'm obviously the Australian Government representative for the Department of Agriculture, Fishery and Forestry here regionally. Our primary role is really to sort of negotiate market access where we don't have protocols in place, or to improve, negotiate for improvements of protocols. So in the case of Ecuador, our industry was asked the department to make some amendments to the fumigation requirements for Ecuador recently. So I negotiated that with the regulatory authorities in Ecuador. We've had sort of similar discussions around Peru as well, but they haven't progressed as yet. And then the other core area where we get engaged is if there's any sort of sanitary or phytosanitary issues at the port of entry. So if there's an issue with the certificate, sanitary or phytosanitary certificate, those sorts of things, we'll get engaged in terms of assisting the importer to clear the shipment through working with the regulator. In the case of Peru, it's obviously SENASA, and in the case of Ecuador, that would be Agrocalidad. So that's what the Department of Agriculture, Fishery and Forestry does. In terms of Austrade, we did, I'm not sure if the Austrade rep's online, but Austrade's our trade promotion agency in Australia. So they work very closely with the Australian industry, interested exporters of barley, and making connections with importers and end users in the markets where there's a demand to import Australian produce or commodities. So in the case of Peru and Ecuador, we've got an Austrade office in Lima. We also have other Austrade offices regionally here in Latin America, but the Lima office is there to assist in terms of working with Peru and interested companies in Peru to facilitate trade and those commercial linkages. In the case of Ecuador and in the case of Latin America more broadly, we have an office in Brasilia, in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and they have broader responsibility for agricultural trade promotion regionally. We can also help with that in terms of the Department of Agriculture, Fishery and Forestry, in terms of making those linkages with Austrade, but that is their role in terms of promoting the commercial aspects of trade. It's not a Department of Ag, Fish and Forestry.
Thank you for the correction there, but that's a very important role that the Australian government has, that you deal a lot with the inbound governments as well that cover Ecuador, Peru, Brasilia. So thank you, Ian. While I still got you, there's one more question that's come in, so we'll just hang there before I'm going to go back to Lloyd. So what protocol requirements and tariffs are in place for exports from Australia to Ecuador and Peru? Because your role is very critical in negotiating those trade agreements, the bilateral agreements, and resolving some of those trade agreements.
Yeah, sure. So we've already got a free trade agreement in place with Peru. So the PAFTA, Peru-Australia Free Trade Agreement. Under that agreement, we've got zero tariff on entry into Peru. So there's obviously an MFN, most favoured nation, but zero tariff for Australian barley. Into Ecuador, we also have an MFN. We don't have a free trade agreement, but we have an MFN. So the duty applied is zero for barley. Malt is a little bit different. If you want me to provide the figures for both of those markets for malt, I can do that as well. Just let me know. But we've got protocols in place in both countries for both Ecuador and Peru. The only market really we don't have a protocol in place where there's demand here regionally, I think at the moment, is in Brazil. but we're working on that obviously as well. But I can provide the sort of details on the protocol separately for anyone that's interested.
That's great, Ian. I think your details are available on the program here. So if anybody's got any questions, they'll be able to contact you from the program or email in at AGIC. We can forward and connect you in together. So we're coming to an end, but Lloyd, don't think you can get away with only answering one question. So we are having a big grain season here in Australia. And the question is, I realise that it's early days to be forecasting our tonnage, the amount of grain we're going to get, the quality of grain that we're going to get, and our potential exports of barley. But what's your crystal ball on Australian exports compared to last season? And where do you see the major changes?
That's a tough question for for a wrap-up. Thanks for that.
We've got a few traders there, Lloyd.
I mean, it's a difficult environment in the world where we've got uncertainty coming out of the Black Sea, supplies, larger Black Sea barley supplies than we had last year, which will typically go into the feed market. We've got a larger Canadian crop. They've returned from a savage drought, once in a decade drought, maybe worse last year. Now they're back to good production. And then you've got the downturn that's kind of forecast to continue on Saudi imports, and then economic uncertainty. I think demand is probably going to be the biggest question for Australian barley exports rather than supply. You can see that in local markets at the moment, and I think you can see that in other parts of the world as well, where we've seen kind of values of French barley starting to sink away as they search for demand. And so I think that, I think barley exports will be down on last year. Crop size tells us that. But I think it's probably going to be a more difficult environment in finding those markets as well, just because of kind of increased competition from the likes of Canada, but also probably a softer demand, and a number of the forecasts, USDA and International Grains Council have pared back their barley trade forecasts on the back of that.
Righty, so thank you, Lloyd. So interesting time ahead for our harvest, but big production year. So I dare say over that 7 to 8 million tonnes of exports markets of Australian barley. We don't have any more questions coming through. So I'd just like to thank everybody that's come online. And I'm going to hand over to Ian to provide the final closing comments. Thanks, Ian Mortimer.
Thanks, Mary. I just firstly wanted to thank AGIC and all the participants. This fantastic seminar series that's been organised by AGIC regionally here, and it's great to have a good technical exchange and reach out to sort of end users and consumers of barley regionally in Latin America. I wanted to thank all of the presenters today. So thank you, Mary. Thank you, Marie Ringland, our ambassador to Lima. Thanks to Lloyd George for your comprehensive presentation on sort of the state of play in terms of production in Australia at the moment. It's exciting, but we've got a lot of product clearly we've got to sell. And Elisa, it was fantastic to hear from you in terms of the quality around accreditation and what's required, and the robustness of Australia's system around recognition of those new barley varietals as well. Marco, thanks also for your comprehensive presentation from A and B InBev. It's clearly a really good market in both Peru and Ecuador, and obviously you guys look after Colombia as well, and that's another important potential market for us down the track once we get an FTA outcome on malting barley through the CPTPP. And just in terms of summary, I think Marco's points are really critical. This is a really good opportunity for us to exchange views between Australia and importers and interested end users, and I'd like to see these forums continue. The trade relations we've got with Peru Ecuador in particular, and the imports have had some initial sort of teething problems with the trade, and through these sorts of dialogues, those sorts of issues can be worked through and managed so that we've got good long-term sustainable trade. Australia is a safe and reliable and high-quality producer of grains, including barley, and we really value our relationships with our customers, Marco. So thanks again for your participation and everyone else's on panel. And hopefully we look forward to seeing everyone again soon for another round of discussions. So thanks, Mary.
That's excellent. Thank you, Ian. And I would like to actually thank Ian. He's been quite the nucleus behind pulling this webinar together and getting Marco to speak. So thank you very much, Ian. You're a very a polished operator as the Ag Councillor covering South America. So with no further ado, I'd like to thank all the speakers and close this webinar out, and we will send a link of the recordings to everybody that has registered. Have a great evening, our friends in Ecuador, Peru, and enjoy a beer to increase that consumption. Okay, take care, and signing out. Oh, before we go, please participate in the poll. There's a poll at the end of this webinar. If you could participate in the poll. It's just going to be launched right now. Thanks, Sean. See you, everybody.